Welcome to your personalized deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a question that's both historical and honestly a little unsettling. How much does Saddam Hussein's rule, mirror the ancient kings of Mesopotamia? You sent over this scholarly article that makes that comparison, so we're going to unpack its key insights and hopefully have some aha moments along the way.
Yeah. What's intriguing about this article right off the bat is it doesn't just list similarities.
Right.
It actually tries to analyze why these patterns of power pop up across such vastly different time periods.
Oh, okay, so like a dictator starter kit.
Kind of, like we're looking for the human blueprint behind building a dictatorship.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so first things first. The article jumps right into the whole absolute power thing. No surprises there, right?
Yeah.
Both Mesopotamian kings and Saddam, they weren't exactly known for sharing the decision-making process.
Nope, not at all. But, the article digs a little deeper and it asks how they achieved this control.
Okay.
And that's where the parallels get really interesting.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
They both use similar tactics like fear, carefully placed loyalists,
Okay.
spies everywhere.
Wow.
It's like dictatorship 101, but, with millennia between the students.
That's a great way to put it. The article mentions how the Mesopotamian kings would constantly shuffle governors around, even relocate entire populations.
Right.
Almost like they were playing a game of Risk, but with real people.
Exactly.
Just to make sure that no one got too powerful.
Precisely. And Saddam, he took it a step further.
How so?
Modern technology gave him an intelligence service that was just insanely sophisticated.
Right.
So think of the ancient systems of informants, but just turbocharged with 20th century tools.
Okay, that's a scary thought. And it wasn't just about the behind-the-scenes control. The article talks about Saddam actually trying to bring back the idea of monarchy.
Yeah.
Like renovating royal cemeteries, acting all grandiose. Did he really think he could be, a Mesopotamian king in the 1980s?
Well, he wanted that historical clout, Remember, this is a guy who made his National Assembly sign loyalty oaths in their own blood.
Talk about making a statement.
Oh, yeah.
That makes signing on the dotted line seem pretty tame.
For sure.
Okay, buckle up, because now we're getting into the part of the article that's, tough to stomach.
Yeah.
Both the Mesopotamian kings and Saddam, they weren't shy about using violence to keep everyone in line.
And here's where the article kind of reminds us that violence isn't new to Iraq. It's almost like it's baked into the region's history, from the Assyrians to the Mongols. It's almost like that legacy made brutality part of the political toolkit for anyone who wanted to seize power and keep it.
Yeah. The article quotes Sargon II, bragging about unleashing a terror never to be forgotten. And then centuries later, Saddam's doing the same thing, using torture and executions to make sure everyone knew who was boss. It made me realize how consistent the language of terror really is. It's chilling.
And one detail that really got to me was how Saddam would actually film his atrocities and distribute the tapes.
Oh, wow.
It's like with technology, terror itself gets an upgrade.
Right. It's a whole new level of awful.
Yeah.
It makes you think about how quickly even good tools can be twisted.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit before things get too heavy.
For sure.
The article also dives into propaganda, which, honestly, both Saddam and the Mesopotamian kings were amazing at.
Yeah.
I think palaces, statues, epic tales of victory. It's all about image control, really.
And it's where you see just how timeless human behavior is,
Yeah.
Whether you're carving a scene on a wall or controlling the TV news, rulers get how powerful shaping the story is.
Yeah. Saddam even wrote novels where H.E. was the hero battling evil America.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Part of me kind of laughs, but it's also, kind of disturbing. Like, haven't we seen this play before?
Definitely. The article points out something that I hadn't thought about before. Saddam's biographers basically did what ancient scribes did. They built up these heroic myths around his early life.
So it's like self-promotion transcends technology.
Exactly. Makes you wonder how much of any historical figure's story is spin.
Right. Okay, deep breaths, everyone.
Yeah.
Because now we're getting into the religious aspect, and this is where the article gets really careful.
Mm-hmm.
Both the Mesopotamian kings and Saddam, they used religion to justify their actions and, make their rule seem, ordained by a higher power.
Absolutely.
But it wasn't the same playbook.
Right. And here's why. For the Mesopotamian kings, religion was power. They were seen as literally chosen by the gods.
Okay.
So war was a divine mission.
Right.
Building projects, acts of piety, their whole system was built on that belief.
So how does that compare to, say, Saddam putting Allahu Akbar on the Iraqi flag or, making sure that he was always filmed praying? Was any of that genuine?
Well, the article argues that Saddam was more pragmatic with religion.
Okay.
He used it when it was useful.
I see.
Think about it. This is a guy who's known to enjoy things that are very un-Islamic, right?
Right.
But he also knew how to use faith to rally people, especially against enemies like Iran.
So it's almost like he figured out how to weaponize belief, which, honestly, when you think about it, is even more disturbing than genuine faith, right?
Mm.
It's like he figured out how to tap into that human need for something bigger than ourselves, but for his own gain.
Exactly, and that cynical approach to something so deeply personal for many people, that's a pretty unsettling pattern that we see in a lot of modern leaders, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Okay, we've covered absolute power, violence, propaganda, religion, feeling overwhelmed yet,
A little bit.
but there's more.
Yeah.
The article also dives into the massive building projects that both the kings and Saddam were obsessed with.
Right.
Temples, ziggurats, palaces, the whole look how powerful I am thing in concrete form.
Oh, absolutely. It's a power move as old as time. And remember Saddam's mother of all battles mosque?
Oh, yeah.
Talk about a guy wanting to leave his mark, literally.
It's almost like they read the same playbook, even thousands of years apart.
Mm-hmm.
But wouldn't that require believing their own propaganda? Like, how much of that grandiosity is for show, and how much do these rulers actually believe they're doing good?
That's the question, isn't it? Do they convince themselves, or is it all just a performance for the masses? And
Yeah.
if it works, does the motivation even matter?
Right.
That's the unsettling part.
Okay. So before we move on to part 2 of this deep dive, I'm genuinely curious. What's sticking out to you so far? What's the most surprising parallel or the thing that makes you rethink history a bit? Take a moment to mull that over. We'll be right back with more.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the surprisingly similar reigns of Saddam Hussein and the ancient Mesopotamian kings.
So far, we've seen how they both aced Dictatorship 101. Absolute power, not afraid to use violence, masters of spin. But, this article, it goes even deeper. It's like they both knew history was just as much a weapon as, like, an army.
Yeah, absolutely. The article spends a good chunk of time on this idea of seeking a link with the past. Both Saddam and those ancient kings, they were obsessed with connecting themselves to a glorious history.
I mean, Saddam went all out, right? Like reviving old titles, throwing elaborate funerals for ancient kings, even rebuilding Babylon with his name on the bricks, of course.
Classic power move. You
Yeah.
know, by associating themselves with these legendary figures, they tapped into this well of respect that already existed. It's like saying, hey, I'm not just some dictator, I'm part of this epic lineage.
So it's almost like they're like borrowing legitimacy. Like, hey, if Nebuchadnezzar was great and I'm just like him, then I must be great too. But isn't that kind of flimsy?
Yeah.
History's full of, well, not so great kings too.
Right, and that's where the propaganda machine comes in.
Okay.
The article talks about how Mesopotamian history was basically rewritten under Saddam. You know, it became this uniquely Iraqi heritage all about justifying his rule in the present.
Right.
And it makes you realize how easily history can be manipulated, right?
Absolutely. It's like history is written by the winners, but then the winners get to decide what kind of winner they were. Okay, back to Saddam's historical obsession.
Yeah.
The article highlights this one example that's just too perfect. The emblem for the 1988 Babylon International Festival.
Oh, yeah. That one's a gem.
Tell me about it.
They took Saddam's face and basically superimposed it onto Nebuchadnezzar's.
Oh, wow.
And to make it even better, they elongated his nose and the image to match.
Talk about subtle. It's almost funny, but also kind of creepy how far he was willing to go to make that connection.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't just grand gestures like rebuilding Babylon. Saddam brought those ancient Mesopotamian themes into everyday life. So government-sponsored festivals based on, old rituals, buildings covered in Assyrian reliefs, even fashion shows with women in Assyrian-inspired gowns.
Wow. So it's like he was trying to create this whole neo-Mesopotamian aesthetic.
Yeah.
Was he actually trying to revive the culture, or was it all just about him?
It's hard to say for sure, but the article seems to suggest it was more about building his persona as the strong leader,
Yeah.
A continuation of Iraq's supposedly glorious past,
Right.
which, is a pretty effective way to distract people from the problems of the present.
It's amazing how all these pieces fit together.
Yeah.
The power grabs, the violence, the spin, the historical revisionism. It's like a how-to guide for building a dictatorship, but spread out over thousands of years.
Right, and that's what's so valuable about this deep dive, right?
Yeah.
It helps us see these patterns, how they play out over time, and hopefully how to spot them in the present day.
Absolutely.
But let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about how both Saddam and the Mesopotamian kings wanted to, look like heirs to this grand tradition.
Right.
But what about their actual approach to warfare? Did they share any similarities in, how they fought and justified their wars?
Well, from what I remember, warfare in ancient Mesopotamia was pretty much constant.
Yeah.
Kings were expected to be warriors, leading their armies and expanding their kingdoms. It was part of the job description.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about military skills. The whole concept of divine war was central to their, worldview. They believed that the gods were basically deciding who won and lost, and victory was, a sign of divine favor.
So it wasn't just about strategy. It was about having, the gods on your side.
Exactly. And this belief played a huge role in, how they fought. So kings would consult priests and diviners before going to war, looking for signs from the gods. It's like they needed, a cosmic thumbs up before launching an attack.
And I'm guessing those priests weren't exactly giving out thumbs downs very often.
Probably not. But, it wasn't just about getting divine approval. They also used religious rhetoric to justify their wars. It was always, a holy mission, a fight against enemies who had offended the gods.
So basically, religion was used to demonize the enemy and rally the troops. Sounds familiar. But what about Saddam? I mean, we know that he invoked Islam during the Iran-Iraq War,
Yeah.
but how much of that was genuine faith versus just, political strategy?
Well, the article suggests that Saddam was more of a pragmatist when it came to religion.
Okay.
While he definitely used Islamic rhetoric, especially during the Iran-Iraq War, his actions often, contradicted those pronouncements. Remember, this is a guy who wasn't exactly known for strictly following Islamic law in his personal life.
Right. We talked about that earlier. So it seems like he was willing to use religion as a tool when it suited his purposes, but it wasn't necessarily a core part of his belief system.
Yeah.
But wasn't that still kind of risky? I
Yeah.
mean, weren't people going to notice the hypocrisy?
Maybe, but remember, he controlled the narrative. His propaganda machine was incredibly effective at shaping, public perception. And let's face it, in times of war, people are more likely to cling to any message that offers hope or justification, even if it's not entirely consistent.
Right. So it's like he figured out that even, calculated faith can be a powerful weapon.
Exactly. And this brings us to another interesting parallel between Saddam and the Mesopotamian kings. Wartime propaganda.
Oh, okay.
They were both masters at manipulating information to, control the story and shape how people saw the war.
Oh, yeah. Saddam's state-run media was infamous for that.
Yeah.
Constant boasts about Iraqi victories, downplaying any setbacks. It was all about keeping morale up and, presenting this image of strength and invincibility, even if things were falling apart behind the scenes.
Right, and that tactic's been around for centuries. The Assyrian kings, for example, they were notorious for their propaganda.
Ooh.
They'd exaggerate their victories, downplay their losses. They even erased defeats from the official record. It's like they were writing their own version of history even as they were making it.
So it's like fake news isn't a new thing. It's just gotten, a technological upgrade.
Right, exactly.
But it makes you realize that we always have to be critical of what we're being told, especially during, times of conflict.
Absolutely. Always question the official narrative, look for multiple perspectives, and be wary of anyone claiming to have a, monopoly on the truth, especially when bombs are dropping and emotions are running high.
Well said. So we've seen how both Saddam and the Mesopotamian kings used religion to justify their wars. They employed, sophisticated propaganda to shape public perception. But what about their actual military strategies? Do they share any similarities in how they organize their armies, the nuts and bolts of warfare?
That's a great question, and it's one the article tackles head on. In ancient Mesopotamia, military service was often mandatory.
Okay.
Kings would draw on their vast populations to build these massive armies.
So like an ancient draft.
Yeah.
Where everyone who could hold a spear was expected to fight.
Exactly. And these armies were surprisingly advanced. They had specialized units for different combat roles, infantry, cavalry, archers. The Assyrian kings in particular were known for their military innovations, especially in like siege warfare.
Yeah.
And they weren't afraid to use, brutal tactics to terrorize their enemies into submission.
Sounds intense. How did Saddam's military stack up against these like ancient war machines? I mean, he had tanks and planes and stuff.
He did, and he invested heavily in modernizing his army, giving them advanced weapons, training them in modern warfare techniques. But, at its core, the principle was the same: build a large, powerful army through conscription.
Right.
It's like different tech, same playbook.
It's fascinating how certain like strategies just seem to transcend time. Like, is there like a dictator's handbook out there somewhere that they all get passed down through the ages?
Maybe there should be. And here's another parallel that points to that. Both Saddam and the Mesopotamian kings relied on elite military units that were personally loyal to them. So the Assyrian kings had these king's companions, these highly trained warriors who acted as like bodyguards and shock troops.
And Saddam had his Republican Guard, right? The ones who were like better equipped and supposedly more loyal than the regular army.
Exactly. They were Saddam's Praetorian Guard, protecting him from coups and internal threats. It's like every dictator knows that you need a core group of soldiers who are only answering to you no matter what.
It's like a built-in distrust of your own system, right? Like you create this like massive army, but you also need this smaller inner circle that you really trust. It's kind of paranoid when you think about it.
It is, and it highlights a key aspect of authoritarian rule, the constant need to like secure your power base even from within. But let's talk about what happens after the war is won. How did they handle the people they conquered? Were there any similarities in how they ruled those they subjugated?
From what I know about ancient Mesopotamia, conquered people weren't exactly treated to like a welcome wagon.
No.
Heavy taxes, forced labor, sometimes outright enslavement. It wasn't pretty.
Yeah, you're right. The article points out that conquered populations were often treated harshly, but there was some variation. In some cases, conquered people were allowed to keep their customs and traditions as long as they paid their taxes and, didn't cause trouble.
So like a kind of don't rock the boat tolerance.
Exactly. But in other cases, kings would forcibly relocate people, break up communities, and even try to like erase their culture and language. It was all about preventing rebellion and solidifying their control. It's like, you can live here, but you have to be like us, which, never really works out well for the people being forced to change. But what about Saddam? We know he was brutal, but did he also use those tactics of, forced assimilation?
The article doesn't go into specifics on that,
Yeah.
but it does highlight that Saddam, like the Mesopotamian kings, wasn't afraid to use violence and terror to control people. Remember, we talked about his torture chambers, his secret police, his willingness to eliminate anyone he saw as a threat.
Yeah, no kidding. It's clear that he wasn't winning any humanitarian awards.
Yeah.
It's pretty disturbing how consistent those patterns of, oppression are, regardless of time or technology.
It is, and it highlights like a fundamental truth about power.
Yeah.
It corrupts. And the
Right.
more absolute the power, the more absolute the corruption.
Yeah.
It's a cycle we see repeated throughout history, and it's one we always have to be vigilant against.
So to recap, we've seen how both Saddam and the Mesopotamian kings, they used religion as a tool.
Yeah.
They manipulated information.
They built their armies in similar ways and weren't exactly known for their compassion towards, their enemies. It's a pretty bleak picture, honestly.
It is, but it's a picture we need to see clearly, because by understanding those patterns of power, we can hopefully recognize them when they emerge in our own time. And maybe, just maybe, we can find ways to, break the cycle.
Okay, before we head into the final part of our deep dive, I have a question for you.
Okay.
Given all these similarities, what stands out to you as like a big difference between Saddam and those ancient kings? We'll be back to explore those differences and hopefully find some glimmers of hope in just a bit. Welcome back to our deep dive. We've been exploring all these striking parallels between Saddam Hussein and the kings of ancient Mesopotamia, but now it's time to kind of flip the script a little bit.
Right, exactly. We've seen how they both wielded power in these surprisingly similar ways, but it's crucial to remember they were operating in, completely different worlds.
Right. It's like they both aced Dictatorship 101, but maybe they had different elective courses. So what stands out to you as like a major difference between Saddam's regime and those ancient Mesopotamian kingdoms?
Well, one difference that jumps out is the very nature of their societies. Ancient Mesopotamia was a world of, city-states with limited communication and transportation.
Okay.
So holding on to power over vast territories was a constant struggle.
So even the most powerful Mesopotamian king was working with like a much smaller toolkit.
Exactly. Saddam, on the other hand, he ruled a modern nation state.
Mm.
He had access to technology that gave him a level of control those ancient kings could only dream of.
Right.
Think about like mass media, telecommunications, sophisticated surveillance.
It's like he was playing the same game, but with cheat codes.
Right.
He could monitor his citizens, spread propaganda, crush dissent, all with a speed and efficiency that would blow Nebuchadnezzar's mind.
Precisely. And that technological advantage really changes the game. It allowed Saddam to exert a kind of total control that simply wasn't possible in ancient Mesopotamia.
Okay, so technology is a big one. But there's another difference that keeps, kind of nagging at me. Ideology.
Yeah.
The article points out that both Saddam and the Mesopotamian kings use these, like, opportunistic tactics.
Yeah.
But it feels like ideology played a much, bigger role back then.
You're absolutely right. For those Mesopotamian kings, their power was deeply intertwined with religious beliefs. They were seen as chosen by the gods, these intermediaries between the heavens and earth.
Okay.
Their authority came from this, cosmic order.
So their actions, even like the brutal ones, were often justified within, that religious framework.
Exactly. Yeah. War was a divine mandate. Building projects were acts of piety. Even their laws were seen as, reflecting the will of the gods. It was a system where religion and politics were completely intertwined.
Saddam, though, he kind of seemed to use ideology more like a tool he could, pick up and put down whenever it suited him.
Yeah.
We talked about how he'd ramp up the Islamic rhetoric when it was politically useful, but his, actual beliefs and actions often didn't match up.
Yes, his real ideology seemed to be like the maintenance of his own power.
Right.
He was a master at shifting positions, manipulating narratives, even adopting elements of different ideologies if it helped him hold onto control.
So while the Mesopotamian kings were often bound by the ideological frameworks of their time, Saddam was much more flexible,
yes,
more willing to adapt and change to get what he wanted. He wasn't playing by the same rules.
Exactly. And that speaks to another key difference. The role of the individual. In ancient Mesopotamia, the king, even a powerful one, was still seen as part of a larger, cosmic order. His actions were limited by tradition, religious beliefs, and the influence of, the priestly class.
So even a king who was, worshipped as a god still had to answer to someone.
In a way, yes. He wasn't completely free to act as he pleased. Saddam, though, he cultivated this, cult of personality.
Right.
He presented himself as the sole source of authority, the ultimate decision maker.
Okay.
His entire regime revolved around him.
It's a much more personalized kind of power where the individual leader becomes the central focus rather than a divinely appointed king or a representative of, some grand ideology. It's all about him.
Precisely. And that cult of personality allowed Saddam to consolidate power in ways that would have been difficult for a Mesopotamian king who always had to navigate those religious and traditional limitations.
Okay. So we've got technology, ideology, and the individual leader. Any other big contrasts that come to mind?
Yeah, one final difference that I find fascinating is how they viewed their place in the world. The Mesopotamian kings, despite their ambitions, they often saw themselves within a regional context. Their goals were usually about controlling Mesopotamia, fighting off rivals within the region.
Saddam, though, seemed to have much bigger aspirations.
Right.
He wanted to be a major player on the world stage.
Exactly. He saw himself as this, pan-Arab leader, a modern-day Saladin who would unite the Arab world and restore its past glory. His ambitions stretched far beyond the borders of Iraq. He wasn't content with just being another Mesopotamian king.
It's almost like he was playing a different game entirely, with higher stakes and a much bigger board.
Yeah.
But didn't that ambition ultimately lead to his downfall?
It certainly played a role. His invasion of Kuwait, his defiance of the international community, his pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, it all stemmed from that desire to be this dominant force in the world. He overplayed his hand.
It's a reminder that power can be intoxicating and, unchecked ambition can lead to disastrous consequences.
Yeah.
It's like the old saying, the higher they climb, the harder they fall.
And that brings us back to, the importance of understanding history. By examining the parallels, the differences between Saddam and those ancient kings, we gain a deeper understanding of how power works, how it's used and abused, and how even the most powerful individuals are shaped by the world around them.
This deep dive has been like a wild ride.
It has.
Uncovering connections I never would seen before and making me think about history and power in a whole new way.
And that's the point, isn't it? To learn from the past, both its triumphs and its tragedies, so we can make, better choices in the present.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this. What did you take away from this deep dive? What surprised you? What made you think? And most importantly, how can we apply those lessons to our own lives and the world we live in today? Remember, history isn't just something that we read about in books. It's a conversation that's still unfolding, and we all have a part to play.